spending some time listening to me muse about my career so far. I want to thank Tim for asking me to do this. I will confess that when he asked me, my response to him was, you know, I'd rather listen to what other people have to say about their work. It's a lot more interesting to me than my own work, but I'm very glad to have said yes, because it's given me a chance to reflect a little bit on some aspects of the ways in which personal relationships in our field of anthropology and in the field with the people we work with affect the work we do. I want to recognize that this is a highly personal account on my part. I'm guessing that some of you, maybe all of you, will know the people who I speak about, will have known the people I speak about, or know the people I speak about, that you will have known them and experienced them in ways differently than did I, that you will have met them in different stages of their lives. And having reached this stage of my 70th decade, I recognize that I'm a lot more mellow than I used to be. It's hard to believe. And some of the folks I met were in that mellowing out stage. I'm going to try and talk for about 40 minutes and leave plenty of time for discussion. Some of what I'm going to say is going to be telegraphic, since I'll be able, I hope, to expand on it when we do. This is the outline of what I want to speak about. I've got about 15 things. I'm going to take you from my doctoral training all the way through to my current views on multiple ways of engaging here. Mostly I'll be talking about my work in political and legal anthropology. I want to begin, though.
Robert,
Yes.
could you talk a little bit louder?
You know, this is a really interesting thing. This is going to steal some of what I had to say, but you'll see I worked with Mary Foster, and through that is this any better, Tim? Because I moved the mic.
Yes, that's good.
Okay. She brought George Foster to one of my talks, and of course I asked afterwards, what did George think? And she said, George couldn't hear a word you said. So I'm really sorry. That's who I am. I have to yell at you if I want to project. So there you go. Anyway, I was trained at Binghamton University, what was called SUNY Binghamton. I studied with Stephen Strait, who is a linguist, who I don't know if Steve is on this call or not. I know he's a member of this group. I was preparing to work on, I didn't come to graduate school with a particular geographic area of focus. Steve worked on language acquisition, the acquisition of phonetics in Yucatec Maya. So I began working on that, planning to study language acquisition among Yucatec Maya speakers. I was planning to do a straightforward kind of anthropological study. It was inflected by work that I had done as an undergraduate with Charlie Laughlin, who was also on my doctoral committee. Those of you who know Charlie know that he started a tradition called biogenetic structuralism, which was concerned with trying to locate structures in the central nervous system. It's been a fairly productive research program for Charlie and for others. And as I was working with Charlie and with Steve, I became interested in philosophy of science. So I took, I didn't leave my anthropology doctoral program at Binghamton. I just enrolled in a second doctoral program at Indiana. And I went there and I met this guy because I was studying philosophy of science at Indiana. And the anthropology department was kind enough to give me an office or space in the room that they had for their doctoral students. And so Tim and I guess it was an old house. I think we must have had offices and rooms that used to be bedrooms across the hall or somewhere in the house. I finished my doctoral training, preparing to do work in the Yucatan, and in fact wound up working in Yucatan and in Belize. And I completed my dissertation in 1976. In December of 1976, I was living in Atlanta, Georgia with my former spouse at the time. And I couldn't get an academic position, which is what I had hoped for. So as Tim said, I worked for the Department of Public Health and the Atlanta Public School System for a couple of years. I continued to write on language acquisition and on philosophy of science, and I taught at Georgia State University. Well, I moved from Atlanta to Chicago in 1979, and I was able to do that because in the spring of 1979, I was a visitor at Roosevelt University. But then not for the first time in my life, when that semester ended, I was unemployed. And so I did what you usually do when you're trying to find work, which is you network, and I started networking. But I convinced myself I had a lot of extra time, and I spent that time in the archives of the University of Chicago Library reading all of Robert Redfield's papers. I was taken by this correspondence that was part of Redfield's papers, the correspondence between Tax and Redfield that spans their entire relationship from when Tax was just finishing graduate school all the way up to just before Redfield died. And I was particularly fascinated by the exchanges they had about fieldwork in Guatemala. So I was networking and reading, and one of the ways that you network, of course, is to be handed from one person to another. And I was handed to a social work professor at Chicago, whose name was Helen Harris Perlman. And, you know, as any of us, I think, would do if we got a query from a young colleague, she invited myself and my former wife to dinner, or to dessert rather. And we went over and we met with Helen and her husband, Max, and she was very supportive. But she said to me, and I'm paraphrasing, but I think it's pretty close to a quote, "I don't really know what anthropologists do, so I don't know how I can help you. I really only know one anthropologist. Would you like to meet him?" And of course, networking, I said yes. She said, "Well, he travels a lot, so I'll have to let you know when he's available," which is only at that point that I say, "Who is it?" And she said, "Oh, it's Saul Tax." And of course, I knew Saul from the founding of Current Anthropology, from having read knew of him, having read his work in Guatemala, and knowing what he had done for the discipline. So I was also active I'm a Vietnam era person, so I was active in the draft and war resistance, and I knew the book that he had done on the draft. So I was actually quite nervous at the prospect of meeting Saul. And I will say that this is one of those happenstances that turned out to change the direction of my life in many ways. So eventually Helen called me and said, "He's in his office, give him a call." And she gave me his number, and I called him. And this voice at the other end of the line said, "Hey, drop off your dissertation." I found my memory is it was kind of a gruff, sort of clipped voice. "Drop off your dissertation and I'll read it and get back to you." So I had published on work on language acquisition in Belize, and I had published on philosophy of science in Current Anthropology. So I dropped my dissertation and those articles off at Saul's office and waited and networked and waited. And eventually I got a call from him a week or two later saying, "I'm in my office, come pick up your stuff." And I got there, and my recollection is that I knocked on his door and I looked into what I recall as a fairly cavernous, overstuffed office full of books and papers, with this little guy sitting at the end of the hallway. And he looked up and he said to me, and this is, "You're a very good anthropologist. We have interests in common. Sit down." And that started what was a friendship and a collaboration that lasted through the rest of his life. So shortly after meeting Saul, I became the assistant for program analysis to the vice president for planning at the University of Chicago. And that meant that I spent almost every afternoon going for walks with Saul along Lake Michigan. And I consider those walks to have been something of an informal postdoc. We wound up talking about papers that we wrote together. We had conversations about the work he had done in the development as the field developed, particularly with Redfield, um, uh, about the Guatemala work. And I had expressed to him how thrilled I was with the correspondence about fieldwork in Guatemala. And he gave me permission to edit and publish those letters. He also spoke to me about Action Anthropology and the relationships he had with Reitz and Thomas and Gearing and others, and how these had affected things. And I was coming from philosophy of science and history of science. I had an interest in the ways in which individuals' professional and personal relationships affected the work that they did. So I spoke to him about the work in Guatemala. I spoke to him about Action Anthropology. And I've continued to work on Action Anthropology and to work as an Action Anthropologist. But I'm going to leave that sort of pathway aside for the rest of this talk and concentrate on work in the political and peacekeeping and peace and security field. One of the things that Saul and I talked about a lot were his organizational activities, the Darwin Centennial, the founding of the of current anthropology, the way he traveled around the world, about his work with the International Union of Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences. Well, the IUAES, in my view, was a very important organization for a time period when we didn't have Zoom and couldn't meet our international colleagues very easily. So we could meet them once every 5 years. And I had never been to one of these meetings. And in fact, I had never, although I'd been outside of the United States, I had never been to Europe. And in 1981, the IUAES hosted their first intercongress in Amsterdam. It was intended to give their working commissions a chance to do commission work. And they put about 15 small seminars, what they called scientific seminars, into place around that meeting. So I wrote to the organizers of the seminar on the future of structuralism, which I fully didn't expect to get an invitation, but they said, sure, we'd love to have you. So I told Saul, and Saul then talked to me more about the publication of the 1973 papers from the Chicago World Congress, and asked me to talk to the folks at Mouton while I was there. And he also gave me a letter of introduction to the AAA representatives to the IUAES, who happened to be George Foster. So I gave George that letter on the first day of the intercongress, and I'm happy to report that George completely ignored it. I didn't hear another thing from George, but it turned out that his spouse, Mary LeCron Foster, who is known to all of you as Mickey, was also in the seminar on the future of structuralism. And that seminar was 2.5 days. Afterwards, Mickey asked me if I'd like to have coffee with her. And at that coffee, I learned that Mickey had done a Wintergren symposium in which Charlie Laughlin, my old undergraduate mentor, had participated. So we had a connection there. And then she said to me, and this is my telling, she and I had different tellings of this tale, but I like mine better, of course. She said to me, gee, you look like someone who's interested in peace. To which I said, well, of course. I explained about my objections to the Vietnam War, my application for conscientious objector status, my having lost my draft deferment my first year of graduate school and having been called up, and then having been deferred, not for my views, but for my health. That was kind of a weird thing. had an argument with the lieutenant who was reading my medical records. But at any rate, I was deferred, so I was able to go through graduate school. And then Mickey said, would you like to organize, anthropologists ought to have something to say about our current problems. Look, it's 3 minutes to midnight on the clock of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Anthropologists ought to have something to say about this. Would you like to organize a session for the next World Congress? And I said, I would be happy to work with you to do that, thinking, what is a session? A session is 5 people getting together, talking about a common theme. Not so hard. You can tell that I didn't know Mickey very well at that point, because afterwards I learned that what Mickey had in mind was contacting every anthropologist in the world who had ever published anything about peace and conflict resolution to see if they might participate in the symposium. So we spent lots of time writing to people all around the world. And we got lots of really excellent responses. And we then began to form a symposium and a set of symposium. We had so much interest that we applied to the Ford Foundation for a grant. And we got that grant, and the grant was to support the participation of people, anthropologists from the Third World, what was then called the Third World, and from, I guess, what you call the Second World, the Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. So we did that work together, and we then formed together at the 1983 World Congress in Vancouver 4 days of coordinated symposia, supported by the grant from the Ford Foundation. We had 2 days up in Harrison Hot Springs, a couple of hours outside of Vancouver, and 2 days at the Congress. Those were really exciting 4 days, and the people who participated in it were very, very interested in forming another commission within the IUAES. And so we applied for and were able to create at that meeting the Commission on the Study of Peace, which later became the Commission on Peace and Human Rights. Now, we had lots and lots of folks collaborating with us. Here are just a few of them. Bill Beeman was important, Paul Dowdy, who you all knew, Wally Goldschmidt, Carol Greenhouse, and I think Alice is on this call. Alice was very active in this as well. And the commission was chaired initially by 3 people, Valery Tishkov from the Soviet Union, Peter Worsley, and Margaret Clark. And we began to work, and we had several meetings in California. So you have a small picture from Margaret Clark, taken at Margaret Clark's house, where Bill Beeman, Tom Weaver, and I plotted out some programming for us. And what we did was I became the executive secretary. I was sort of casually employed at that time, going from soft money position to soft money position. It made sense that I would do the work of the executive secretary. And so I began by publishing a quarterly newsletter, which we sent by regular mail all around the world. And some of you may have received it. It had lots of news and an occasional article, brief article. When I eventually moved to Egypt in 1988, Paul Dowdy took over editing it and turned it into what he called a news journal, gave it the name Human Peace. But before 1988, we organized sessions at meetings like the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the AAAs. I co-organized a meeting at the Soviet Academy of Sciences, a meeting at the Indian Institute of Technology in Kanpur that Alice Kehoe attended. We have somewhat different recollections of that meeting, but it was an interesting meeting. And I facilitated some research exchanges between ethnographers from the Soviet Union and the United States going to each other's countries. While I was doing that, my own work began to focus on the ways in which culture affected international security strategy, and I published in 1987, 88, a paper sort of setting out my views on the ways in which international security strategy was affected by factors of culture. Mickey and I published together 2 books, anthologies on the first Peace and War from the Vancouver meetings, and the second later in 1988. And then when I took over the journal, you can't read that. I can't even read it here. It's Social Justice, Anthropology, Peace, and Human Rights. We transferred the Human Peace News Journal into an actual journal, which we published at Syracuse for 4 years, and then transferred it to George Mason University. I don't believe it ever came out from George Mason. I have a belief that anthropologists really need to go into the field periodically. And I was beginning to look for an opportunity either to return to Belize or to do something else, at which point Mickey told me about the International Peace Academy, which is now called the International Peace Institute. But it was at that time dedicated to training diplomats and military officers about peacekeeping. And so I approached the International Peace Academy, which was then headed by retired General Indarjit Ricky, who had been the military advisor to several secretaries general at the United Nations, and asked him if I could work through the institute or through the academy to study what peacekeeping officers and diplomats understood, knew, and so forth. And so he invited me to do that by attending their various meetings around the world. And in particular, I went for their 2-week Vienna seminar, where every summer they would train diplomats and military officers. And at that first, I gave my pitch to the folks who were there at the first meeting, that is the officers and diplomats who were being trained, and they sort of laughed at me, said, culture has nothing to do with what we do. And then we had an excursion which took us to the foreign ministry in Vienna, and one by one, as all the male diplomats got onto the bus, every single one of them was wearing a blue suit. And they looked at each other, and they looked at me, and they said, oh, maybe. And so I began to collect information from them. But about that time, I was introduced, going back to Saul, by one of Saul's students, Joan Ablon, to another anthropologist, Sandra Lane, who I am now married to. And Sandy was recruited by the Ford Foundation to go to Egypt, to work in their Egypt office. So I went with her, and I transferred my research from studying the meetings of the International Peace Academy in a very sort of Gregory Bateson sort of way, to what I thought was going to be a fairly straightforward ethnographic study of the United Nations Truce Supervision Organization, which is the organization that oversees the armistice, or oversaw the armistice between Israel and all of its Arab neighbors. So what you have here is a picture of the El Arish UN outpost with a couple of peacekeepers, joking with one another. I believe that this is a picture of the 2 people who I was working with. They spend a week in the desert, living in these containers and patrolling. And this was an American officer and a Soviet officer. And at night, the Soviet officer was tutoring the American officer about Soviet strategic thinking, so that the American officer could take an exam which would contribute to his professional military education. It was quite an interesting set of work. To be, truth in advertising here, I was the second, as far as I know, I was the second anthropologist to study anything about peacekeeping, the first being Marianne Heiberg from Norway. It's my lasting regret that I never got to meet her before she passed away. She had done some work in Lebanon. So I began writing about peacekeeping, and I published several articles about it. And when I came home, I wrote Peacekeeping Under Fire. But along the way, the kinds of relations, so I'm going to sort of put a bracket here and say, I've been talking about how the meeting with Saul led to the meeting with Mickey, which led to the work on peacekeeping, which has shaped my whole career. But I also want to go back and say that for a long time, anthropologists have been aware that the reciprocities we have with the people we work with in the field are extremely important. When I did my field research in Belize, the education community, the teachers in the schools asked me if I would help them prepare for their certification exams. And so that's what I did. Well, when I came back, when I lived in Egypt, I also was doing work on eye disease there. The people from the village that I worked with would occasionally show up at our house in Cairo and solicit favors like, getting them visas to the United States. So I'm sure this is a common experience. I would go to the US Embassy with them and do whatever I could to facilitate, usually not much, but you would act in good faith to reciprocate the great gift of learning that they had given you. So in the mid-1990s, one of the officers who I had worked with in Egypt was at the US Army War College, and he asked me if I would please work with one of his colleagues at what was then called the US Army Peacekeeping Institute, who had a project jointly with, and that person's name was Colonel Jim McCallum. Jim was working with Jarrett Chopra at the Watson Institute at Brown University, and they had the idea that special representatives of the Secretary General, that's the person in charge of most peacekeeping operations, needed a manual that would help them establish missions that were not siloed. And they asked me to write a chapter for this handbook that they were writing on culture and peacekeeping. And so for the next 4 or 5 years or 6 years, I did work with them. The handbook never came out, although all of the articles that were prepared for it were published independently in different venues. And I trained students at Syracuse University about peacekeeping, and the folks at the Peacekeeping Institute reciprocated by spending a day with us telling us about the US views of that. So I was training students at Syracuse, and I had a doctoral student named Carrie Fosher, who perhaps many of you know. And Carrie was preparing to do work for her dissertation on medical anthropology in Guatemala. And every time I passed her in a computer lab, she had material up about first responders. And so I asked her why she wasn't planning on doing her dissertation research on first responders. And so her answer at that point, as I recall, was, I didn't know you could do that. And I said, of course you can. So Carrie wound up doing a dissertation on first responders in Boston. And it's come out as a book called, from the University of Chicago Press, under construction. And it examines Homeland Security, first responders. Now, Carrie was about to go into the field. She was actually in the field in August of 2001. And you all recall what happened in 2001 September. Well, Carrie had several outstanding grants. And she had an advisor, me, who has a very sick sense of humor. So after 9/11 happened, I called her up and I said, I guess you're getting all your grants. And as it turned out, she did not. She got a National Science Foundation grant. but the Winter-Gren Foundation turned her down because the reviewers did not believe that she could get access to the first responders. This is a very interesting note about anthropologists and our views of things. I was pretty sure that if I said I was going to go study a secret society in Belize, that I wouldn't have any question about whether I'd have access if I represent, but this is a different, I digress. And another graduate student was Brian Selmeski. Brian had been a military officer and was writing about the ways in which in Ecuador, indigenous people were incorporated into citizenship under the direction of Hans Buchler. I was a member of Brian's committee. But after completing their dissertations, they actually went to work in non-academic positions. Kerry went to work at Dartmouth for a center that on emergency preparedness, and subsequently was recruited to work for the Marine Corps. And Brian went to work for the Air Force. He'd worked in Canada for a while, but he worked for the Air Force in their Culture and Language Center. And so they were very active in the early 2000s in the group of people who were worrying about questions of culture and military action. Now, that conversation was going strong, and there was lots of contention within the Anthropological Association about this. This was what I consider to be a classic case of an agency meeting trouble and saying, "Oh gosh, we thought we were going to do really well, but things aren't working the way we thought it would work. And what can we? Oh, it must be culture." So the Department of Defense had sort of started its push to learn about the culture of Iraq and Afghanistan. And that produced lots of really bad advice, lots of Beltway bandits offering to sell their faux cultural knowledge. And so this was a lot of discussion going on about what security anthropologists were doing and so on. And then, of course, the article by Seymour Hersh about torture at Abu Ghraib came out, which escalated that. And then, of course, the Montgomery McFate's work on the human terrain teams came out and began to dominate those discussions even more. So the group of people who were working on questions of culture and military affairs thought it would be good to have a session in which they explained to the rest of the association what it is they actually do, since they're not out killing people and they're not out planning missions and so on. And so they put together a session that was very anodyne, had 4 or 5 people describing the work they did doing archaeology at various forts and in Iraq, on how they prepared things to help preserve antiquities during the Iraq War to get military folks to avoid them, how they taught introductory anthropology at the Naval Academy. Basically, pretty vanilla stuff. But you know, anthropologists are too clever by half sometime. And I think maybe Brian and Carrie, who organized the session, inherited some of my slightly sick humor. And so they organized the session and they called it The Empire Speaks Back, which was not reflective of the nature of the work that was being talked about, but it got everybody's dander up. And at the subsequent business meeting in 2007, somebody stood up from the floor and said, "Yesterday there was a session here on The Empire Speaks Back. Everybody who participated in that session is a war criminal and should be banned from the association." To which there was broad applause. I was sitting in the audience. I was the discussant at that session. I couldn't believe that people were being called war criminals and nobody was saying that our leaders, our president and the folks on the DS weren't saying, well, let's be careful about our language. I'll come back to that during discussion. But I got up and I left and I called home. Sandy was not with me. And I said, "Sandy, you're not going to believe this. I have gone from the Students for a Democratic Society to being a war criminal all in one lifetime. And, you know, I didn't take it that seriously, but I guess I took it somewhat seriously because it still rankles. But about that time, some of my friends and colleagues authored the Counterinsurgency Manual, and they very graciously exempted work on peacekeeping from the things they refused to do. I have strong views about this movement, which I can talk about. They resolve down to there's a certain naivete about the way things are approached, and the idea that you could separate peacekeeping from war making was one of the levels. The idea that the military is not an institution we should engage because we are in solidarity with folks who are at the margins of state power is another, since I view anthropology as a study of all humans, including institutions that we might abhor. So I worked together with Laura McNamara, who I'd been connected to by my students, Carrie and Brian, at an for an SAR seminar in Santa Fe, which produced Dangerous Liaisons. Now, I thought everything was going along just swimmingly. This was 2011. But at the 2011 meetings, I ran into a colleague who looked at me quite frantically, sort of upset, and said to me, "I thought you were a peace anthropologist. I just came from a meeting where I heard you were a war anthropologist," which struck me as kind of interesting in the sense that I had understood that anthropology had abandoned binaries many years prior, but apparently we were re-embracing them. So I published about this in the Dangerous Liaisons book. There's a long autobiographical chapter about the various ways in which I've worked with, against, and about, rarely for, the national security state. And I think that we all have multiple identities that we move among, from those that make us complicit with those state actions to those that confront them, that are controlled by our own independent theoretical views. So, I mean, I'll be happy to talk about this and elaborate others. As I said, this was going to be telegraphic. But I just want to bring things back to Saul by saying that when Saul had an opportunity to write the introductory piece about his work for the Annual Review of Anthropology, he titled it Pride and Puzzlement. And so I want to return to that because as I look back on this work that I've been doing, I have a great deal of pride in the work that I've done, but I also have a great deal of puzzlement, because as far as I can tell, all of the work that we did in the 1980s and 1990s on the anthropology of peace and human rights has been eclipsed from, at least from the citational sense, from anthropological discussions, and I am continually puzzled why that should be. Anyway, that's a very quick and rough journey through some personal relationships and how they affected the work that got me here. I have probably more substantive and interesting things to say about the action anthropology side of it, but that would be for another time in another year. So thanks very much. I'm happy to elaborate, talk about any of this stuff.
Okay, thanks a lot. Robert, would you stop sharing screen?
I will.
Thank you. And thanks very much. Fascinating. So much, you know, I've kind of known peripherally the various things that you've been involved in, but never heard you, you know, kind of link all of these things together, the many different and interesting strands. And you didn't even talk about your, you know, work with students and led in
That's the action anthropology part.
vulnerable anthropology and so forth, equally fascinating, and which you've, you know, recently been publishing in, and Human Organization and AAP and stuff like that. So, but in the next, I, you know, just want to see if there's anybody who would, and of course, I understand you're willing to talk to us about any of these topics that you've raised and maybe a few that you haven't.
I'll
So,
talk about anything. And it looks like Alice has her hand up.
yep,
Yes.
Alice, go ahead. Alice, you're first.
Yeah, I'd like to start because I was literally physically side by side with Robert in the 80s during the strong effort led by Mickey Foster to establish peace studies, capital P, capital S. It transpired that two women grad students, quite separately, came to Mickey very upset because each of these young women had proposed doing dissertations on interrogating officers who were saying that they really were peacekeepers, even though they were U.S. Army higher rank officers. Each of these young women readily got access to very high level officers, and it seemed to, or at least some of us, obviously their access was granted because they looked like pretty young American girls. Of course, they were quite serious advanced students. So at any rate, each of them did have opportunities to interview very high-ranking Pentagon officers. And they then formally proposed these dissertations to their respective university committees, and each of them had been turned down. And each of them talked to Mickey Foster, partly because she was a woman and she understood the cultural situation of men in power, including anthropology's professors, looking very kindly down and smiling upon women, and then completely ignoring whatever these women might seriously be wanting to do. And as a matter of fact, among these prestigious professors definitely was George Foster, who never took Mickey's work seriously. George was department chair at Berkeley for many years. He definitely was a leader with power, and he never supported Mary's work. I think if he had, we would have had a very different story. But at any rate, so what I wanted to add was the failure of Mickey and the few of us on that committee working for peace studies, Paul Doty being one that's familiar to us, the failure to get the American Anthropological Association to endorse peace studies as a subfield of American anthropology. So there are various people attempted to do this, but it was never established. And it came down to the big cultural situation, which is in Europe too at the time, that even very well established professors, such as Kenneth Boulding and Johan Galtung in Norway, each of them said that when they worked to get funding to establish institutes for peace studies, Boulding at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and Galtung at I guess, Oslo University in Norway. Anyway, both of these leaders said that they were told by funding sources that peace is nothing you can study. Peace is the absence of war. And if they call these institutes for conflict resolution, they would get funded. And both Boulding and Galton did this. And sure enough, an institute for conflict resolution was funded. And this tells you how deep and strong is our culture. And then this is European Western culture, because Galton had the same experience. It all goes back to Bishop Augustine of Hippo, called Saint Augustine, who said, to have peace, you must first have war. You have war, then you can make peace. And that has been foundational.
Thanks a lot, Alice.
Okay.
Thank you
Before
very
you,
much.
before you go to Rick, let me just say that I'm not sure that this is the case, but I believe that one of the young women that Alice was speaking about was Donna Brassé Shira, and she has an
Yeah.
interesting
Yes,
article,
yes. Yeah.
article in the second book that Mickey and I did. But here's a quote from one of her interviews with a Air Force general, and the general said to her,
Yep.
if it came down to a choice between ourselves as a nation versus the survival of the species, I would have to say that as a nation, we would have to look out for ourselves first and the species second. So,
Okay. Rick, go ahead.
Yeah, this is, I suppose, a little bit of a tangent, but in talking about peace studies, I thought maybe I should mention a trajectory at my university, which was rather different, but has also led to a substantial program in peace and conflict studies. I spent my career at Kent State University. Most of you, I imagine, will remember 1970, May 4th. There was a confrontation between the National Guard and student Vietnam War protesters. And 13 students were shot, 4 of them were killed. It was a major turning point in the American attitude toward participation in the Vietnam War. And the university has tried to respond to that incident in a variety of ways. But one of the things that happened was that a unit was created shortly after the shooting in 1970, called the Center for Peaceful Change. It was a unit that was, I think, within arts and sciences. It was separate from any of the extant departments. It has gone through a number of changes since then, but now it is known as the School of Peace and Conflict Studies. And it is a pretty well-regarded unit within the university, and I think also across universities. So it is not directly involved with anthropology, although some of us, including myself, have been involved over the years in one way or another with the unit. But it is definitely an academic unit that is focused on peace studies and has had some significant longevity.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you. Robert, did you want to say anything about that?
well, it's sort of self-serving what I'm about to say, but Rick, the former head of that group was a PhD from the program on the analysis and resolution of conflicts at Syracuse. So
Who-
Pat Coy.
Oh, yeah, Pat is fairly recently retired, but he's
Yep.
still in the area.
Yep.
Sid, go ahead, and then we'll go to
Yeah.
Marjorie. Okay?
I know nothing really about these peace study programs, and I appreciate it, and I thank you because I've learned a lot in this last hour. But I think that the comment just made about the general sums up everything that I've known about efforts at peace studies, because my personal reaction, and I happen to work in Brazil, where the United States government was involved in supporting a military coup that led to a military dictatorship. And I happened to fall in on where Americans were teaching Brazilian military how to torture people. And of course, that took me to a whole history from then of saying, I don't believe that there's anything that we as anthropologists have to contribute to people who, as the general said, would rather destroy the planet than not, quote, defend the country, by which in the United States' case, we mean take over the entire planet so that we can use its resources to keep our economy and our military going. So again, I thank you for filling me in, but what you've done is reinforce what I think were my own biases to begin with.
So Sid, let me agree with you and then demur from what you've said and explain to you why I think the view you've just expressed is exactly wrong. The US military does some pretty horrific things and is trained to in many ways to break things and kill people. There's no question about that. But the US military is an extremely large and diverse organization. And with any large and diverse organization, as within any society, there are various different themes, different sets of commitments. And so while there are certainly folks who do what you abhor and what I abhor as well, there are others who are much more thoughtful. And I have to say that the very first paper that I wrote after doing field work was and presented at the AAA meetings. In that paper, I confessed to my own anti-military biases and how they had been shattered by both the intelligence and curiosity and humanity of many of the people I'd seen on peacekeeping missions. Not all of them, but many of them. And then when I began to work with the U.S. Army War College, I discovered an openness at that level to critique and to critical thinking that I did not see displayed in discussions of anthropology in the military among anthropologists who pride themselves on being open and flexible thinkers. So I think that painting with a very broad brush, it just blocks us from contributing meaningfully to conversations where we might make a difference, where we might get people, organizations might get them to do things other than business as usual.
But Robert, empirically, I find at least in terms of my observations, they always come down on the wrong side, doing horrendous things to people on the ground. And it's very nice to talk to people. I'm trying to think, was it Marvin Harris who once said, it makes good talk, but let's look at what's going on the ground. And again, I think it's nice. I'm learning a lot. It's nice to talk to people. I'm glad there are good people in the military. It just turns out that the people in charge always wind up doing these horrendous things. That's all.
Well, this is probably a longer conversation, but I
Yeah.
think we'll turn to Marjorie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. I hope anybody can hear me. I apparently,
Okay. Okay. I want to keep the spirit of not wanting to deal in binaries and worrying about the danger of them. And yet I'm afraid I'm going to point out another one. This is kind of a footnote, but nonetheless a sad one in the history of anthropology and our relations with Russia. Valery Tishkov, and you remind me that he had been in that commission on human rights and peace, or it was the other way around, peace and human rights, has now been one of the most active Russian academics for the war in Ukraine. And it is an appalling turnaround that at first, in the spirit of what you were just saying, I tried to use my old friendship with him, etc., and it's been impossible. I can't talk to him anymore. He has become extraordinarily hardline Russian nationalist. And it's as if all of the years of the interaction with his colleagues internationally had just disappeared. I'm not sure whether you have any insights into this. I just wanted to mention it as a kind of sad footnote, because in the spirit of non-binary thinking, one would have hoped for better.
I agree with you about that. But so about Valery, the first 2 days of the 1983 4 days of conference were up in Harrison Hot Springs, and Valery came there by himself. So this was the Soviet Union was still going strong. There was a considerable amount of discussion among people about how it is that he could get around without a minder. So I'm not sure that this was that what he I couldn't hear you. Now I can't hear you.
He didn't change his stripes, is what I think you're trying to say.
Maybe. But the last time again, you've gone. We can't hear you.
His track record in intelligence is not the point. I mean, that's been known for many years.
No, but the
point is that he was actually able for many years to use that position to actually do some fascinating exchanges, including what we used to call ethnic processes, when really it was about ethnic conflict and getting Western advice, anthropological exchanges concerning what were developing ethnic conflicts throughout the whole Soviet Union that were, of course, according to Soviet propaganda, non-existent, but according to the specialists, so existent that they really wanted international help. I was in on those exchanges from the get-go. As a junior scholar, I was allowed in 83 to be part of them, and it's a surprise because of the nuances even within the intelligence community that we've returned to that binary thinking.
Yeah, I'll say that I have no special insight into Valery, except I ran into him, I guess in the late 90s, early 2000 on the campus of the University of California, Berkeley. I was about 30 or 40 pounds heavier than I am now. And the first thing he said to me was, "You put on a little weight." So tact was not part of it. But let me move on to Steve.
Yeah, you're muted. You're muted, Steve.
Not anymore.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Just a quick question for a very complex issue. You were in Toronto for a couple of days, I think, at the meetings. How do you feel anthropology dealt with the Israeli-Hamas conflict? So
I was not in Toronto, Steve. I didn't go because I was removed from the program. I wanted to participate in your ethics panel, and the AAA told me I couldn't. So I don't actually know what happened in Toronto. The week before I was at I was at the American Public Health Association meetings, and I was there in part because I've been part of a small group that over the past 2.5 years had developed a policy for them on Palestine and Israel and cooperation and peace building, which got completely scuttled, obliterated because of the war. So I don't know what anthropology did, but I do think that I have views on the boycott issue, but they're not of the moment. So I guess I can't answer that. Or I could just blather on and be totally uninformed.
That's okay.
Why were you removed from the program?
So
Yeah.
well, it's not because I said sex was
Yeah.
binary. It's
Why?
because I was participating in another roundtable where I was a roundtable presenter, and
Oh,
apparently being on a roundtable is a major role. So they wouldn't let me on 2 roundtables.
So they canceled you for both?
No, the other one was the first one that I signed up for. It was virtual. So
Yeah,
it was one of the
that's-
virtual
I see.
sessions. So they
I
canceled
see.
me on the second one.
I see. Because I remember you presented that.
Yeah.
Jim Weil.
Thank you. There's something you touched on I'd like to ask you about, but I want to lead into it. And it may sound glib, but it's a question of going into the belly of the beast to learn about the heart of the beast. It seems that there is a place for research, including talking to generals, to find out what's going on there, not necessarily to work with them and try to make them kinder. You know, I'm more like Sid, that if it's a structure and agency kind of thing, given a certain structure, there's very little wiggle room to do anything as an individual or even within an organization. So I don't have that much of that hope either. But you did mention something with UN peacekeeping forces. And so this is maybe another thing that sounds kind of glib, but it's that point of to catch a thief, you know, to catch a thief, you are a thief kind of thing. There was a movie with that name.
mhm.
If there is armed conflict going on, just talking and being nice may not be enough. There's a way of having to counter that, to stop it, as would be a potential for a UN peacekeeping force that has to be prepared and armed and militarily capable, but try to prevent or stop fighting. So I wonder if you can say anything more about peace studies being peacekeeping. And there is that euphemism of pacification, like what was, you know, done in Vietnam. That's talking about making peace, but peace through destruction, peace through domination. And clearly what you and Alice and others have been trying for years and years is proactive peacekeeping. So is there some kind of a role for people who are capable as military forces to maybe be there to stop conflicts or to prevent conflicts or stop them when they happen? Can you say any more of research about that and potential for that?
Sure. So to do that, I need to give a very brief sort of history of at least multilateral peacekeeping. Prior to the 1990s, prior to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, most, not all, but most peacekeeping missions were observer missions, and they were staffed by military officers. And the rationale, the logic for that was that they would report, monitor, and not enforce, but bring to the attention of the international community violations of ceasefires and other such agreements. That depended on a certain view that the international community had could express some moral suasion, and that countries wouldn't want to be held out on the world stage for violating things. After the fall of the Soviet Union, peacekeeping changed from observer groups to multifunctional peacekeeping, and many of them are expeditionary. So long ago as 2010, I think, I wrote a piece in which I argued that peacekeeping had become a recreation of imperial policing. And that has to do with the political dynamics of our global political system. The second thing, though, is there are efforts at civilian peace monitors, and military officers sometimes do participate in that. It's good for people to know what they're seeing so they can report accurately. So there is a role. I'm not sure I'm getting your question, Jim, but there is clearly a role for people who have seen war. And I'm just as a side, I'll add that at least the officers who I've worked with, to a person, have expressed the view that if there is any way not to go to war, they would prefer that. Having seen it, they don't want to do it again.
Yeah, so what
And-
I was getting at was beyond preventing outbreaks or doing something there to stop them, is there any role for actual military intervention to stop a conflict? Because we've learned from many cases, in that terrible quote of whether you choose your own country over humanity, that it has to transcend national interests. And national interests are where there are armies, but even smaller groups' interests, that their goal is not the good of all, but their own group's good. And so at some point, it has to go beyond that. And I don't know if that's something that has to happen. The United Nations is fascinating in principle, but it doesn't have real power. And perhaps it's so structured that it serves the most powerful nations and not peace altogether. So trying to untangle all of that to see if there has been any role for actual military actions that are there to stop military actions that are partisan for one small group or for a whole nation. And that seems to be kind of how we have to look at the future if we're going to survive as a species.
So, part of the response to your observations, Jim, depends on an understanding of the United Nations system and what the initial hopes were for it, and what's happened to it. When it was first organized, it was envisioned that there would be a military associated with the United Nations. There was there still is a military advisor. There was a committee that would meet. I'm not sure it's been meeting, but when the Cold War set in, those hopes were dashed. You couldn't get a standing military for the UN. So the UN has no capability independently to go and intervene in advance. That does practice what it calls the preventive diplomacy, but that's not military action per se. Also, the nature of the authority, if you will, of the UN has really shifted as countries and non-state actors have broken what used to be respected international norms. So this is a very complex discussion, and it clearly depends on reform of the Security Council. And it's really hard to reform a council in which 5 of its members can veto the reform of it. So this is an enduring challenge and problem for the United Nations and for its credibility. And most of its actions rely on credibility. So, and as opposed to power.
Robert, it's we're getting near the end, but since I'm the host, I can ask 1 or 2 more questions. But the thing that I'd like to have you come back to a little bit is the role of peace and culture, from the anthropological perspective within the discipline. Why is it, do you think, that there has been, there was such a strong reaction to your, participation of people like you in peace studies, and how, why were you called a warmonger? I'm still thinking about the, just wanted to think about, the Montgomery McFate's human terrain system, which was an interesting experiment in bringing culture into the front, and I'm thinking also the militarization of police in the United States and the reluctance of many police units to include social workers, cultural anthropologists, sociologists, and others who could come and defuse particular situations because of their understanding of cultural nuance. And I guess we don't really need to give the explanation. We all understand of that. So I wonder if you could just kind of unpack a little bit of that, and why anthropology has not taken, the discipline has not taken a stronger stand in trying to bring culture into both peacekeeping abroad and at home.
Okay, I realize that this is the Association of Senior Anthropologists, but I hate to sound like a really old curmudgeon here. But my view is that anthropology lost its way some time ago. And if you take anthropology to be the study of humans, then it's a study of all humans, not just the humans we like. And, the history of our discipline in the United States has waxed and waned more in recent years and recent decades over its engagement with the state. There's all sorts of stuff here. When we train students, even students who come into doctoral programs saying, I do not want to be a professor, I want to do something in the real world. By the time they finish, the only thing they can imagine doing, if they're going to be successful, is to be a professor. There's something wrong with the incentive system that we have within our discipline about what counts. I mean, if I was a clinical psychologist, I would make more money in practice than I would as a university professor. I'd have an interesting career. We have a real problem, in my view, and now I'm just thinking out loud really, about how we treat people who do things in the world. And now I'm going to put in a plug for my spouse, who is a medical anthropologist and who here in Syracuse was working on reducing infant mortality in our communities, which is horrible. And she noticed that the women who were having low birth weights and miscarrying, she's just walked in while I'm talking about her. Have a good class.
Should I go say hi?
No, because I'm trying to describe your bacterial vaginosis work, unless you want to describe it.
Hi, everybody. I'm running off to teach. Any questions about TV?
I haven't.
Everybody's there.
I haven't gotten to the substance. I haven't gotten to.
Sorry.
I haven't gotten to the substance of it yet.
Oh, okay.
So
Have a good time.
You too.
So in reviewing medical charts, she noticed that the women who were miscarrying seemed to have an infection. And she said, let me go and figure out what's going on. She looked at cultural factors and she said, I think this is an infectious disease. And so she identified bacterial vaginosis as one of the risk factors. And she brought it to the medical community, who said, nah. So she devised a study that demonstrated that you could treat that, and you can count the number of babies that survive in Syracuse as a result of the intervention that she created, 32 a year. When she applied for a job at Syracuse University, the response was, we'd never hire an anthropologist who does that kind of work. We have a real problem valuing fairly esoteric, heavily jargon-laden theory over getting things done in the world. That's a rant, and I apologize for it.
You are not excused.
Okay, well.
Those of us who've had an applied focus, practicing anthropology focus, are aware, been very aware of this. And, I think Jay, particularly, and Stephen have been particularly sensitive to these kinds of things. But is there anyone else that has a question?
Well,
Very
before you
quick-
do,
very
let me
quickly, Jim.
before you do that, Sid, let me draw your attention to Jay's comment in the chat, which is an interesting and useful comment. Go ahead, Sydney.
Go ahead, Sid.
No, I was just going to comment that on a personal basis, I found if you get a tenured position at a university, you can then do all the practical stuff you want in addition to that. And in a sense, you still have a position to come to, even if what you try fails completely. So that's a personal thing.
So that would actually be an interesting hook to the Action Anthropology discussion, but we're not going to go
And
there.
salt tax is a perfect example of this.
Yes.
So
But-
that's the thing that I followed.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, I sat down with Robert and Joan Ablon one time, I think at an SFAA meeting, and we went to dinner, and Joan recalled about talking with I forget his name, famous was it Frederick Leach, I think, and who was at the University of Chicago, and he said that Saul Tax is a really nice person and he does a lot of good work. I just, I just can't wait till he comes back to anthropology in reference to his Action Anthropology work.
Okay.
So doing Action Anthropology was not real anthropology. It was playing at something else.
Well, of course, I think that my 1986 article, Reflections on Action Anthropology, explains some of the reasons that it hasn't matured into a school here in the United States. So, yeah. But for those of you who are thinking about the current discussions about decolonizing anthropology, there is no approach in anthropology that is more decolonizing than Action Anthropology.
Yes.
Jay?
Jay?
Yeah, sorry,
Yes.
I am not showing my face because I have a bandage on my nose and I'm very vain, so forgive me for that. I just, first of all, want to thank Robert for a very nuanced talk. I did want to ask earlier on why you think that anthropology is shifting towards the binary, along with a lot of other disciplines and settings in the US and elsewhere right now, but I think that we can save that for another time. I wanted to just point you to my two comments, one of which says that if we live and work in the United States, there's no way out for us. We're working in some way for some institution, even if we're working on our own and consulting, that is paying our rent. And we have to decide where we can work in good conscience, whether it's applied or it's teaching in an academic environment and writing articles. So there's no way out. So we just have to talk about the ethics of our work all the time. Other fields talk about positionality in their actions, and we don't seem to do that quite as much. The second point is in the second comment, and that is that the Commission on Anthropology, I think it's on Anthropological Careers, is meeting right now. It is trying to change the discipline. It is trying to promote changes in the way departments instruct. It is trying to deal with some of the issues that we're talking about. And we should probably have a look at their website and maybe even attend the last few minutes of their talk. So if you're not members or participants in that commission, I strongly advise it, because it's very hard to change a dinosaur, but they're trying. We are trying.
Let me just put a footnote onto what Jay said about where we work and come back to when I said I had strong views about the counterinsurgency manual. Those views were aligned with what Jay just said about we're all implicated in some way because of where we work. Many of the people who were part of the counterinsurgency manual who pledged not to do any counterinsurgency work nonetheless continued to reap great benefits in terms of paychecks and facilities and access by continuing to work at universities that were heavily and are heavily funded by the Department of Defense. So I guess my my view is that there's nobody pure in all of this.
For sure. I completely agree. Could not agree more.
Okay, and I know that Ryle Nolan and Elizabeth Bryady have been working very hard to set up a set of training standards and professional standards for anthropologists that want to work in the non-academic setting. I think we've reached the end of today's talk, and I really want to thank you very much, Robert, for taking the time to talk and to communicate with us.
Alice is showing us something.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
trying to show
We-
my book. Oh,
Yeah,
it's printed out
militant
backwards. Here it is,
Christianity.
Militant Christianity, which is the history of Christianity from the time of Jesus, Yeshua from Nazareth, to the present time of 10 years ago. And my point was I discovered, which I had suspected, that you can get a lot of data supporting that oppositional dualism in which war is given higher value than its opposite, peace. So I quoted St. Augustine, he's in this book, with that quote. Linguists who have studying Indo-European have actually found that the culture of Indo-European speakers really clearly gives an idea of power to war, to fight, to battle, like Trump. And the most valued person is the man who leads a battle. And this goes back 2,000 and more years. And if you take David Anthony, it goes back 5,000 years to the Yamnaya who invaded from Western Asia and conquered all of Europe. And now there's genetic evidence. They invading Indo-European cavalry massacred men in the conquered communities and took the women. The genetic data is amazingly strong on this now. So at any rate, the history of Christianity is the history of Indo-European speakers who place value on war and conquest, and who believe that peace is nothing but truce between war. And the point is, the book is on academia, and you can upload it free.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so you can upload it under my account on academia.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much,
Alice.
Alice. Thank you. Okay, so I think we're going to call today's talk to close.
Well, then before you do, Tim, let me just thank everybody for indulging me in this sort of personal thing.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Robert.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank
It
you.
wasn't all contrarian. It was very informative. Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, you're not usually so contrarian.
Thank you so much.
Good conversation.
All
I'll
right,
hang
thank-
around until Tim ends the chat, ends the thing.
Okay, Bill, did you have a quick
Yeah.
something?
Very quick. I just wanted, there would seem to be a little sense of where teaching is not action. You know, for those of us who work in non-elite universities, boy, there's a lot of action involved. You know,
Yes.
I was always involved in organizing, conversations with the local community during the Iraq War, having symposia and teach-ins, inviting the local community as well as, and part of my role was to try and wake up these students to a whole other world. And so
Exactly.
I think it's really important not to see teaching as, or being a professor, as something that is not action, right?
It's
I
not
always-
a binary.
Exactly. Thank you, Sid. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
We
Applause,
continue.
everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you very
Tim.
much. Okay, thanks a
Yeah,
lot.
thank you, Tim.
Our next talk will be on February 29th with Rena Letterman. Okay, we'll see you in next month. Okay?